When you think of evil doctors in history, your mind probably jumps to the obvious villains. Joseph Mengele, Nazi doctor who tortured prisoners in Auschwitz, or maybe Unit 731's Dr. Ishii in Japan, conducted biological warfare experiments on living humans. These names belong in the darkest corners of human evil. Absolutely. But here's the disturbing truth that textbooks refuse to explore. The most dangerous doctors in human history weren't always the ones who were deliberately torturing people in secret laboratories. Sometimes the most evil doctors were the ones standing right in the mainstream, ones with prestigious credentials, the ones whose work was published in respected journals, the ones who shaped modern medicine while committing atrocities in plain sight, and history rewarded them for it. Is the story of how the medical establishment itself became a machine of horror. Not because individual monsters wielded scalpels, because an entire system of power, ego, and unchecked authority allowed ordinary doctors to commit extraordinary cruelty while calling it science. The worst part? Many of these horrors continued for decades with full institutional support. Let's start with something most people don't know about: the systematic medical abuse of poor and vulnerable populations that was considered totally legitimate medical practice. In 1950s and 1960s America, doctors would deliberately infect prisoners, the mentally ill, poor patients with syphilis, hepatitis, and tuberculosis. Not because they were hiding these experiments from authorities, because the authorities approved them. This wasn't underground. This was institutional. John Cutler, a man who would later receive citations for his work in public health, deliberately infected over 1,400 Guatemalan prisoners, orphans, mentally ill patients with syphilis in the 1940s. He would later conduct similar experiments in the United States. When authorities finally discovered these experiments decades later, Cutler wasn't locked away. He died of old age in 2003, celebrated by many in the medical community. But here's where it gets even worse. The reason these experiments could continue was because of something far more sinister than individual malice. Institutional apathy mixed with a disturbing belief among the medical elite that certain lives simply didn't matter. And that belief didn't come from nowhere. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a dark philosophy taking root in prestigious medical institutions across America and Europe: eugenics. The idea that certain people, the poor, the disabled, the mentally ill, people of certain races, should be sterilized or prevented from reproducing for genetic health of humanity. And this wasn't some fringe belief whispered in dark corners. This was celebrated in prestigious medical journals, taught in respected universities, supported by influential doctors who shaped the very foundations of modern medicine. Over 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized in the United States alone, with full government and medical authorization. In Scandinavia, the number was higher. In Nazi Germany, eugenics became state policy, and many Nazi doctors didn't invent their ideas in isolation, ported them directly from American medical literature. But forced sterilization was just one weapon in the arsenal. Were the psychiatric experiments. The lobotomy craze of the 1930s through 1950s, thousands of people, many of them perfectly sane but simply inconvenient to their families or institutions, had their brain tissue physically destroyed by doctors driving an ice pick through their eye socket into the prefrontal cortex. Dr. Walter Freeman, the man who popularized this procedure and performed thousands of lobotomies, drove around America in a van he called his lobotomobile, promoting this surgery as a cure-all for depression, anxiety, and rebellious behavior. He performed procedures on patients he'd never properly examined. He did lobotomies in hospitals, clinics, and even informal settings. He was celebrated. Medical schools taught his technique. Hospitals competed to adopt it. Families begged for the procedure to be performed on their relatives. One of his most famous cases was Rosemary Kennedy, sister of President John F. T. At age 23, deemed difficult and prone to mood swings, she was subjected to a transorbital lobotomy by Freeman without her knowledge or consent. The procedure left her unable to speak clearly, incontinent, and essentially a vegetable for the remaining 64 years of her life. Freeman wasn't prosecuted. He wasn't imprisoned. He continued performing lobotomies until a patient died under his care in 1967, and even then, He merely had his medical license revoked. He spent his remaining years traveling and speaking about his work, still convinced of its merit. This is the pattern we see repeated throughout the 20th century. The most evil doctors weren't always discovered and punished. Many of them operated in plain sight, their work published in mainstream medical journals, their reputations intact, methods taught to the next generation of physicians. In Sweden, doctors sterilized over 60,000 people, primarily women and the Roma, over several decades, with full institutional support. These weren't secret experiments. This was public health policy, endorsed by medical boards, and celebrated by the scientific community. When it finally ended in the 1970s, doctors responsible faced no serious consequences. Some went on to have long, respected careers. This is where the real horror lies. Not in individual maniacs, though they certainly existed, but in institutional evil, in a system where authority was never questioned, where vulnerable people were seen as experimental subjects rather than patients, where medical progress was valued far above human dignity. Crucially, where the perpetrators was protected by the very institutions that should have held them accountable. Doctors who performed these horrors weren't aberrations in the medical system. They were products of it, operated within a culture where patient consent was optional, where marginalized populations were considered disposable, where institutional power was rarely questioned. The real evil wasn't individual sadism, was systematic dehumanization wrapped in the language of science. And here's the most disturbing part of all. Many of these practices didn't end because the medical community suddenly developed a conscience. They ended because survivors, activists, journalists forced the issue into the public eye. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, doctors deliberately withheld treatment from black men with syphilis for 40 years to observe the disease's progression, only stopped in 1972 when a whistleblower went to the press. Eugenics policies didn't end because doctors admitted they were wrong, ended because society changed, despite the medical establishment's resistance. If you want to understand the full scope of how medical institutions protected and promoted doctors who committed crimes against humanity, compiled a comprehensive breakdown of the cases, the institutional cover-ups, the astonishing lack of consequences in the description and pinned comment. It goes way deeper than what we can cover here. The second layer of this horror involves something even more insidious. The way the medical establishment created a culture of unchecked authority made these abuses possible in the first place. Doctors weren't just individuals acting alone, were protected by a system that valued their reputation above all else. Medical boards refused to investigate complaints from patients, especially poor patients, prisoners, and the mentally ill, where people society had already decided didn't matter. Their testimonies were dismissed as unreliable. The ravings of the unstable was the perfect environment for predators to thrive. A doctor's word against a patient's, the doctor always won. Consider what happened with Dr. Cotton, an American psychiatrist who became convinced that mental illness was caused by bacterial infections lurking in teeth, tonsils, colon. Between 1907 and the 1950s, he performed thousands of extractions and surgical procedures. Patients had their teeth yanked out, organs removed, all in the name of a theory that was completely, utterly wrong. He called it surgical bacteriology. Cotton published his findings. Medical journals printed his work. Other doctors cited him as an authority. He was invited to speak at conferences, received accolades and respect. And all the while, patients in his care were screaming, bleeding, being permanently maimed. Some died from post-operative infections. Others were left with lifelong complications. Yet Cotton's reputation remained unblemished. He was never prosecuted. He died of natural causes, celebrated in his field. This brings us to the chilling truth. The system didn't fail these doctors. The system worked exactly as designed. It protected them, it elevated them, it silenced their victims. Let's talk about Dr. Ewan Cameron, a Scottish-Canadian psychiatrist working at McGill University in Montreal. Cameron ran the Allen Memorial Institute, and what happened there between the 1950s and 1960s sounds like something out of a torture manual written by monsters. He pioneered a technique he called psychic driving, which was essentially sophisticated brainwashing. Cameron believed he could reprogram the human mind. He would put patients into drug-induced comas for weeks at a time, using LSD, barbiturates, paralytic drugs. While they were unconscious, he would play tape recordings on loop, repeating phrases meant to de-pattern their brains and rebuild their personalities. The patients would wake up with no memory of who they were, had lost their sense of self. Worse, Cameron's work was funded by the CIA. That's right. The United States government was actively paying this man to develop torture techniques. The CIA wanted weaponized psychology. They wanted to turn people into blank slates they could reprogram. This wasn't fringe science. This wasn't a rogue doctor working in secret. It was institutionalized evil with government backing. Cameron's patients, many of them women who came to him seeking help for anxiety or depression, permanently altered. They couldn't recognize their own families. They had lost the ability to form memories. Some spent the rest of their lives in institutions because they were now broken beyond repair. When families sued, when survivors testified, government protected Cameron. Documents were sealed. Records disappeared. The full extent of what he did remained hidden for decades. Here's where it gets worse. Cameron wasn't alone. His work inspired other institutions. Other doctors adopted his techniques. The torture continued under different names, in different buildings, with different government agencies involved. The public had no idea. The victims had no recourse. By the 1970s and 80s, when some of these programs began to be exposed, there was another revelation. Medical community had known about much of this. They had read the papers. They had attended the conferences. They had chosen to look away, chosen to protect their own. Even when evidence emerged that doctors had committed atrocities, medical licensing boards rarely acted. Criminal charges were almost never filed. A doctor's license was his shield, institutional loyalty was his insurance policy, and the victims were left to cope with permanent psychological and physical damage while their abusers walked free. This is the pattern that runs through medical history like a bloodstain. Power without accountability, ambition without ethics, prestige without conscience. The doctors we've discussed weren't exceptions. They were the logical conclusion of a system that placed the reputation of the medical establishment above the welfare of patients. Most terrifying realization is this. Many of these doctors genuinely believed they were helping. They had rationalizations, they had theories, they had institutional support. They published their work, they were celebrated. The system didn't just allow them to commit atrocities, it enabled them, funded them, and protected them from consequences. And the victims? Most of them never received justice. Most of them died without their abusers ever facing trial. Many of their stories remain buried in archived files that few people will ever read. Their suffering was erased from the official record, swept under institutional carpets, and forgotten by a society that preferred not to know. What makes this genuinely horrifying isn't just the individual acts of cruelty. It's the machinery of denial that surrounded them. It's the conspiracy of silence. It's the way institutions protected their own while sacrificing the powerless. It's the realization that even today, we haven't solved this problem. What makes this genuinely horrifying isn't just the individual acts of cruelty. It's the machinery of denial that surrounded them. It's the conspiracy of silence. It's the way institutions protected their own while sacrificing the powerless. It's the realization that even today, we haven't solved this problem. Here's what history teaches us if we're brave enough to listen. Power without accountability always breeds horror. Always. Every single time, across every culture, every century, every continent. The names change, the institutions change, the methods evolve. The fundamental equation remains identical. Unchecked authority plus vulnerable populations equals systematic abuse. Truly disturbing part? The patterns are so clear that if we wanted to prevent this, we could. We have the knowledge. We have the tools. We have historical precedent showing us exactly how these systems fail and what enables the abuse to continue unchecked. We know that isolation is a predator's best friend. We know that lack of transparency breeds corruption. We know that protecting perpetrators is a choice. Not an accident, not an inevitability, a deliberate choice made by people in positions of authority. We know that the institutions most likely to harbour abuse are those that operate in darkness, behind closed doors, away from public scrutiny. Yet despite knowing all this, continue to build and maintain systems that check every single one of these boxes. We continue to isolate vulnerable people. We continue to restrict information. We continue to prioritize institutional reputation over individual safety. We continue to protect the perpetrators while blaming the victims for not speaking up sooner, not fighting back harder, proving themselves credible enough. The doctors and administrators we've discussed today didn't invent abuse, didn't discover some new form of cruelty that had never existed before. What they did was systematize it. They wrapped it in the language of science and medicine. They hid it behind institutional authority. They made it official. They made it bureaucratic, made it respectable. And perhaps that's the most horrifying lesson of all, that ordinary people, people with education, with training, credentials, with social standing, these people are capable of extraordinary cruelty when the systems around them enable it and reward it. It isn't about demonizing doctors or mental health professionals today. Most of them are dedicated, ethical people who chose their profession to help others. But it is about understanding that the capacity for abuse lives within systems, not just within individual monsters. It lives in hierarchy, it lives in secrecy, lives in the gap between what we claim to believe and what we actually tolerate. You want to understand more about how these specific cases were finally exposed and what systemic changes actually resulted from the revelations. We've put together a comprehensive breakdown in the description and in the pinned comment. It goes into the legal battles, the institutional reforms, the survivors' long fight for justice that often took decades to achieve. The cycle of abuse thrives on one thing above all else: silence. Thrives when victims are isolated and made to feel that no one will believe them. Thrives when institutions close ranks and protect their reputation instead of protecting their people. It thrives when we as a society decide that comfort and convenience matter more than truth. Breaking that cycle requires something that feels increasingly rare in our world: willingness to look directly at uncomfortable truths without turning away. It requires holding institutions accountable. It requires believing victims, especially when their stories are inconvenient or challenge our sense of safety. It requires understanding that the comfortable lie is always more appealing than the horrifying truth. It's precisely why we must choose truth anyway. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. See the same patterns emerging in different contexts today, in care facilities for the elderly, in isolated religious communities, modern psychiatric institutions, in foster care systems, in any place where power is concentrated and accountability is weak. The horror of history is that it teaches us lessons we seem determined to ignore. We learn how these abuses happened, we document them meticulously, we memorialize the victims, we promise that this will never happen again, and then inevitably, in different forms in different places, different perpetrators wearing different uniforms, it does happen again. Preventing this kind of horror doesn't require discovering new knowledge. It requires the political will to implement what we already know. It requires uncomfortable conversations. It requires scrutiny of institutions we've learned to trust without question. It requires believing that the comfort and convenience of those in power is less important than the safety of those in their care. For those of you who want to dive deeper into what systemic changes actually need to happen to prevent this kind of institutional abuse, compiled resources and expert analysis in the channel description and the pinned comment that break down the specific policy reforms and oversight mechanisms that could genuinely protect vulnerable populations from predatory systems. The final, most unsettling truth is this: monsters in history weren't uniquely evil. They were ordinary people who worked within systems that allowed them to be evil. They had colleagues who knew what was happening and said nothing. They had superiors who looked the other way. They had institutions that protected them. They had a society that preferred not to ask uncomfortable questions. We are the society they depended on. We are the people who, through our indifference, enable the systems that make this possible today. That's not an accusation, it's an observation. A mirror, and mirrors are only useful if we look into them honestly. The throne of horrors we've been exploring isn't just a place in history. Template, it's a pattern. It's a warning that remains relevant because the conditions that enable such abuse haven't fundamentally changed. Only our willingness to acknowledge them has wavered. What will you do with this knowledge? That's the question that matters now. Will you look away? Will you tell yourself that this is history, that it doesn't apply to the systems around you today? Or will you become one of the people who sees the patterns, recognizes the danger signs, and demands accountability even when it's uncomfortable? Victims of history deserve more than our morbid curiosity. They deserve for their suffering to mean something, deserve for us to learn from what happened to them and to actually change the systems that made their abuse possible. That's not entertainment. That's responsibility. Thank you for watching and for being willing to descend into these uncomfortable corners of history with us. If you found this deeply unsettling in the way that truth often is, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss these explorations. Activate the notification bell because the stories that challenge us most are the ones we most need to hear. If you want to go deeper into the reforms, the survivors' testimonies, and the ongoing fight